Hello, my name is Dr. Funda Goldman. I'm a licensed naturopathic physician with a private practice in Stratford, Connecticut in the United States. And today I wanted to talk to you about homeopathy, specifically homeopathy for new beginnings. And even more specifically, I wanted to talk about the Bach flower remedy walnut for this purpose. Homeopathy is something that I use a lot in my practice for especially mental and emotional conditions, physical too, but the Bach flower remedies I find particularly helpful with mental, emotional, even spiritual disturbances. Before we get too deep into the subject, let me just mention here that the information presented here is for educational purposes only and should not be considered medical advice. For any symptoms that persist or worsen, please consult with a qualified medical professional. And also with homeopathy, it can and should be, in most cases, used with other mental health modalities such as talk therapy. So please note that. To begin with, what is homeopathy? A lot of people aren't familiar with this paradigm of medicine. And as a very general statement, homeopathy is an energetic paradigm of medicine. So, kind of like in physics, when they talk about light, like is light made of particles or is light made of waves? And it's actually potentially both. In this paradigm of medicine, people, diseases, symptoms, remedies are all seen as energies instead of particles. The way that a lot of conventional medicine is seen, very mechanistic, biochemical, that sort of thing. So it kind of takes a different thought process to really kind of get into this paradigm. But there you have it. Homeopathy, to a large extent, at least the homeopathy that I was educated in, is largely attributed to one man, Samuel Hahnemann, who lived from 1755 to 1843. He was a German physician, and he's considered the father of homeopathy. Um, he was a physician, and he gave up his medical practice in 1784 because he had a lot of concerns about the common medical practices that were used at that time, such as bloodletting. He felt that they caused harm to patients, and I guess within himself, he didn't feel okay with that. So he gave up his practice. But he was proficient in many languages, so he spent quite a number of years as a writer and translator. And one of the books that he translated was a Materia Medica, so sort of a listing of botanical remedies. And he was reading about cinchona, or Peruvian bark, um, tree bark. It's a bark from South America. And he was reading that it was known at that time for curing malaria. And what was interesting to him was that diseases of toxicity, so somebody who took cinchona bark who was healthy, ended up kind of producing symptoms that were very similar to somebody who had something like malaria, which cinchona was used to cure. So symptoms of a disease were cured by some sort of remedy that on its own in a healthy person produced similar symptoms, which is, odd. So he started experimenting on himself, and he found that indeed cinchona did produce symptoms in his own healthy body that were similar to malaria. So he, pursued this and experimented and researched it, and he also furthered the work of Anton von Sturck, who is actually a very famous physician in Europe and was a physician to some of the royalty in Europe. Von Sturck, what he did was he actually sort of outlined a way of determining what remedies did. And it really is sort of the outline for modern clinical trials, where you begin by experimenting on animals, and then you kind of take a few people, that's sort of phase one. Phase two is like you take a few people and just make sure that the remedy is not dangerous or harmful, fatal. And then you go into phase three, where you take on more patients or people who are interested in that, and then finally determine, what the clinical usefulness is of that. So that was all happening at that time. But Van Sturck, what else he did was he also noticed in his other research, what he was researching was that he found that small amounts of toxic substances could be therapeutic. And again, the similar idea to what Hahnemann was finding was that what seemed to be toxic could actually help cure illnesses that caused similar symptoms. Hahnemann, kept pursuing this line of research. He developed a method of diluting these substances, these potentially toxic substances, so that they were diluted so much that there was hardly anything left in the water that was used to dilute the substances, and thereby that's why we think of these remedies as more potentially energetic in nature rather than physical or mechanical, because there was so much dilution involved. There's no detectable material substance left in that remedy. By 1800, he had commenced studies using this law of similars, what he determined was a law of similars. And again, this idea of like curing like, he first used the term homeopathy, was attributed to being the first person using that word homeopathy, and he published some writings in it in 1807. And then in 1810, he published the Organon, which as a homeopathic practitioner is considered sort of the big book in this field. So that was his contribution. And then next, kind of starting with homeopathy and then developing it into the Bach flower remedies, which we're going to discuss the particular on Walnut here. Edward Bach, a few decades later, from 1886 to 1936, he was alive and well. He was a British physician, and he started his work at the London Homeopathic Hospital in 1919. So homeopathy was obviously going from its infancy with Hahnemann to actually having been developed pretty well to develop whole hospitals in Europe at that time. And he developed his flower remedies in 1930. His approach was a bit more intuitive. He found that, like, if he had a negative thought or feeling, emotion, that if he held his hand over certain plants, it gave relief. And he felt that the energy of that plant was transferred into dewdrops, which he collected. So again, it's this kind of idea that very minute particles, or what starts off as sort of material substance, can be transferred, some sort of energetic pattern from that plant could be transferred into water. And he collected dewdrops for a while, and then he eventually found that he could also get similar effects by floating flowers in water and sunlight to produce his remedies. So again, this is an energetic paradigm. Although he was trained in conventional germ theory at Cambridge, so he was well trained at highly valued institutions in Europe, he wondered why some people got sick with certain pathogens and others did not. So why was it that some people, if they were exposed to things, caught an illness and others didn't? And he postulated that illness could be considered a conflict of soul's purpose and sort of more material personalities, actions, or outlook. So it was essentially an inner conflict that manifested into mental, emotional, physical symptoms even. So this internal war was what led to emotional disturbances and energetic blockages and eventually illness. So he kind of took homeopathy into probably a little bit more nebulous sphere and potentially even a little bit more of a spiritual, soul level purpose type of medicine. But again, he's sort of coming originally from this idea that you could take small, minute aspects of the substance and develop a remedy from it. But his orientation was, I think, a little bit more, again, nebulous or sort of soft in terms of, the mental, emotional, even today, the mental, emotional, spiritual aspects of people is a little bit harder to grasp, literally. So when we think about walnut specifically as a Bach flower remedy, the main keynote to think about is that, this person's in a stage of new beginnings. Some sort of major physical, mental, emotional, spiritual change is kind of upon them. It might be something like starting a new job or retiring, so stopping work altogether. Those are two very different, cycles and phases of life. Something very biological, such as a pregnancy and or menopause. Those are also big stages, particularly in a woman's life. Moving someplace new, so uprooting yourself and moving, or starting a new program, such as a new school. Those are always associated with big changes. The birth of somebody in the family, the death of somebody in the family, or somebody close to you, that can cause a major shift in different directions in somebody's life. Major illness, that can definitely create a whole new sort of cycle with people, and even recovery from illness, because it may be that somebody's been ill for so long that they actually have to adjust to being healthy. Either way, it's a major change. Marriages, divorces, start of a new relationship, the end of a new relationship, these generally come along with a lot of changes as well. And also things like engaging pretty deeply in psychotherapy, or some sort of spiritual awakening or spiritual practice, such as maybe starting with a yoga teacher training program or something like that. Because again, the psychotherapy and the yoga will stir people on the deepest levels if done well and done appropriately. And so a lot of the sort of strictures or limitations, kind of old habits, old patterns that are sort of crystallized or calcified in somebody through doing deep psychotherapy or spiritual practices, they can start to loosen those up and release or parts of the self that maybe haven't been emphasized or even suppressed. So again, a lot of different circumstances that involve big changes, in which walnut may be an appropriate remedy. So what happens? I mean, people are always going through big changes all the time. So when we have somebody in front of us, and maybe, okay, so we've got that they're going through some sort of big life change, when would, our mind or intuition sort of ding, oh, walnut may be a good remedy for them? Well, the thing is that what you want to look for is not that they're just going through a big change, but that they've made a decision, a firm decision. They want to go in a particular direction. Um, you know, they've made it in their mind, but there's something holding them back from taking that last step and really moving forward with it, like just full throttle. And this is partly due to the increased stress and instability of, on one side, releasing the past and what's known and familiar, even if it's not always like the happiest or most positive past, um, but it is familiar, and then moving into this, unknown phase of life. So there's still something tying to them to the past, and they're unable to drop an anchor and set sail, kind of like the boat in this picture. They're just sort of like in the harbor, and they may have taken a few steps out, but they're not really sailing off, into the sunset on their journey. And also, as part of this, is that because of this instability and sensitivity that's sort of kicked up during this phase, if they're in a walnut state, where walnut is indicated, they may be listening too much to other people. So it could be friends, family, teachers, society at large, instead of listening to that inner voice. And that might be deterring them. That might be kind of holding them back from really kind of setting off into this new phase. They may also be falling back into old habits and relationships. They might be easily distracted. So maybe they've gone off, they've been talking about starting a new school and program, and they're all excited about it. They put in their application, they get it all together, and they're there. And then once they're there, they keep going home, instead of being in their new life, or maybe they find themselves gaming or Facebooking, spending time on social media, or just rather than just being 100% out there in their experience, like they're kind of holed up, or kind of twirling about, um, spinning rather than moving forward. They're spinning in circles with like old habits and old patterns and stuff like that. Because again, they're sort of like anchored, somehow into the past and not moving forward. They might be looking also to like social and family traditions rather than really listening to themselves and what their spirit and soul is telling them. And they might also be easily deterred by minor bumps in the road. So there's always bumps in the road, even if you're not making a major life change. But they might interpret some minor setback is like, oh, I shouldn't, it's like, it's a really easy excuse, like, not to keep moving forward, when more objectively, it's just sort of a minor bump in the road that's really not that big of a deal and shouldn't really, be much. But it's, again, because they're in this sensitive state, um, it is enough to actually hold them back. And the walnut state is something that's usually temporary. So, um, even for people who normally are very confident, self directed, know what they want, know where they want to go, it's kind of like they have this momentary little bit of a lapse, where, again, they're just not fully on board with decisions that they've made for themselves. Um, and the risk of all this is that if they are not able to let go of that anchor and move forward, is that they may risk, abandoning their authentic self and their soul's calling, which is really, um, in some ways a great tragedy, for people not to be able to do that. Um, and the potential outcome of taking, walnut Bach flower is that you'll trust your deeper self and your life's journey. For some people, you might actually become sort of a pioneer. Actually, the two men that I mentioned, Hanuman and Bach, both, they really, essentially let go of their careers and, again, they were both well trained and they had to go against, all the looks and, um, I'm sure, talk that came from their colleagues, and they had to risk their financial stability and their family's well being. They had to risk a lot. But, luckily for all of us, because they were able to work through all of those inner issues and, sort of untether themselves from what society may have been telling them to do, or the medical establishment may have been telling them to do, or their families, friends, whoever, um, that they were able to establish a whole new paradigm of medicine and develop these remedies. And I know I'm truly grateful because, again, I find that homeopathy is amazingly helpful for, especially mental emotional conditions. I mean, physical as well, but especially again, the mental, emotional, spiritual side of people is hard to access a lot of times. And then even if you kind of get in there, like how do you go about, making things better for somebody, for something that's so intangible? And, um, I've seen remedies like this do amazing things in people's lives. So, that's why I'm talking about it and just sort of passing on the knowledge, of people who've come before me, because again, I think that there's really something important here. So yeah, you too, potentially, if you take this walnut remedy, you could become a pioneer, because that's essentially what a pioneer is, right? You kind of have to let go of conventions to develop some new world or discover some new world. You're able to live authentically, be who you truly are. Maybe you're growing up in a family of, of engineers and you're the only artist, you know, I mean, that's got to take a lot, you know, to, you know, go your own way in life. Even if the people around you are supportive, you know, it's just sometimes, you know, within ourselves, it's like we just feel these contrasts and we need to work through that. And ultimately, the biggest goal here is to fulfill your life's mission, whatever that may be, because everybody's mission may be different and unique depending on their skills, abilities, and yeah. Just one word though before I sign off here is that if you're interested in Bach flowers or you know about Bach flowers, there are other Bach flowers remedies that also have as part of their profile the ability to be easily influenced by others. But again, these are subtle and nuanced remedies, so you really have to think about them deeply, and I would even say feel them out differently because each one has a different vibe or personality. And again, there's subtleties here. So to really suss that out, to determine which one is the best among the group here, let me just mention a few. So Century is another Bach flower remedy. And these people tend to be easily influenced, but it's mostly because it's for different reasons. So it's because their own will is weak and they tend to defer to others. So it's almost like if you ask them, oh, what would you like for dinner? And they say, oh, whatever you'd like to have, because they don't quite know what they want. You know, they're always kind of saying, oh, whatever you want is fine with me. You know, that's a different kind of remedy than what the walnut people need. Also, Serato is a potential remedy for people who are easily influenced. These people, it's not so much that they're being influenced by other people so much or taking that, you know, feedback in too deeply, but they know what they want and they have an idea about it, but then they don't trust their inner guide. They don't trust themselves. They second guess themselves. So they kind of know what they're doing, but then they kind of step back from it. So again, that's a different kind of energy than the walnut energy. There's also scleranthus. Scleranthus people tend to go back and forth. They vacillate back and forth. They're, you know, they're hot, they're cold, they're up, they're down. And so because of that, they have this just general lack of mental focus and clarity. And because of that, they don't know which direction to go because they're, you know, vacillating too much. So the reason they may not be moving forward is because they need more mental focus and clarity, and scleranthus potentially can help with that, in addition to other things for, you know, sort of an ADD-like constitution. Wild oat is another potential remedy. In this case, wild oat people are easily influenced because they don't have a defined direction. And they have difficulty making decisions. So they're a little bit different than scleranthus. Scleranthus people are a little bit kind of all over the place. Like one day they want to be an artist, and then the next day, you know, they want to be an engineer, and the next day they want to be a yoga teacher. You know, they're kind of like, whoa. We're wild oat people. They may have two or three ideas about which direction they want to go, but they don't they don't know how to decide between the two or three ideas that they have. So it's a little bit different than scleranthus. Honeysuckle people, there's also this notion of dwelling in the past, but like they're really dwelling in the past. It's not like there's some little hook that's keeping them in the past. I mean, these people are like, I remember one patient I had who was a former professor, and he'd been retired for over a decade, and he still talked as if he was like, you know, up front in charge of a classroom. You know, and it's like, you know, don't want to kind of burst somebody's bubble or whatever. And clearly he enjoyed that time and what that meant to him. But, you know, it's like today was really no different than 20 years prior, you know, and all of the stories were from that. And he wasn't really living in the present because he was so like so much dwelling in the past. So that's a different thing again than walnut. Clematis, these people, I've had a number of these people. They kind of they're not very grounded. They tend to live in a pretty rich inner world. Some people would call it a fantasy world. I remember one, she was a teenager and she just loved to like read books and and she just had her head in the books, and so like whenever she would sort of pop her head up, like just getting chores done around the house, like she couldn't sort of organize herself around that because her mind was just kind of off. I have had another patient who just had sort of a wild imagination, and that worked in some ways because they were a serial entrepreneur and they had these ideas and they could organize themselves around to like make it happen and create these businesses, but they couldn't kind of sustain it because again they were kind of in love or kind of energized by the ideas more than the reality itself. So when things got kind of thick with the business, like they check out and they just want to like create another business. That's really so that's a little bit different. So again, just to kind of demonstrate some nuance with these remedies. And then again, walnut is the one we've been talking about here. So again, it's just this increased sensitivity or instability that happens at the time of a major life change. And that's what kind of throws people off, rather than these kind of other things that can prevent people from moving forward. But again, subtle but profoundly different. So there you go. Hopefully if you're not familiar with homeopathy or Bach flowers, you've now been well introduced. And in particular, um, you might find that the walnut remedy, Bach flower remedy, is particularly useful if you find yourself in this state of mind where something, and it may be hard to detect, it may not even be very clear or tangible, but something is holding you back from really fully moving forward and sailing off into the beautiful sunset and living a purposeful life. So thank you for your time, and until the next one, take care.